great person. Am I on? A great person died this past week, a Presbyterian minister. He was given a half a page in the New York Times. Now, that's pretty good for a preacher, isn't it? Eugene Peterson. You may have seen a copy of the message. He did the Bible and common jargon. Great popular resource. But he also wrote 30 books, and I've been reading him since I've been preaching on the Psalms because he's got several books on the Psalms, and I can't get enough of him. He is the best. I'm going to read all 30 books. He is the best. And as I was reading part of what he wrote about the Psalms, he said something for me today, for us today. He said in one place, sometimes a Christian's best friend is the atheist. Well, my best friend was. His name was Ron. I met Ron when he was a high school senior. I was in seminary, and he was a senior in high school, and my wife was his English teacher. And several times she said, I want to bring Ron home for dinner sometime. I've got this bright young student. I think you would enjoy Ron. Well, we had Ron to our apartment for dinner a couple different times. Have you ever had someone who just kind of stuck? I mean, you met them and they stuck, and Ron just stuck with us for the rest of his life, which unfortunately was ended too soon before his 65th birthday. Ron had a difficult childhood. He had gone into an orphanage. His mother tried to kill herself. He had been somewhat abused in the orphanage, and his sense of hurt and pain was there. I mean, he was also full of life, and we played Scrabble, and we laughed, and we played golf. We vacationed together, did things together. We talked on the phone all of those years. Sometimes those conversations would be hours. They would just wear us out because we didn't know when to hang up. He just kept talking and talking, and Audrey and I would take turns and get a breath. I loved Ron. He was a great guy. He became a college professor, got his PhD from the University of North Carolina, and taught as a professor. I performed the wedding of his marriage. And during all those years, we talked a lot about God, about faith, about belief. And because Ron was so intelligent, a professor and all that, he lived a lot in his head, and he couldn't make it square. Why would God, if there is a God, why would God allow all of this pain in the world? And he couldn't figure that out. But though he couldn't square it in his mind, even though he couldn't understand in his head how God, if there is a God, could let the world be as it is, in his heart, it was all love. For all living things, for cats and dogs and people, and compassion. He felt compassion in his heart for the world. And I told him a couple times, I said, Ron, you're one of us. You're one of us. Yeah, he would almost smile when I would say that, because I could see he was somewhat delighted and thinking maybe that's true. Maybe, I am one. And I told him a couple times, I said, Ron, you're a saint. He was. He died suddenly at age 64. I did his memorial service down in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. And when I stood up before his family and all of the people who had gathered there for his memorial service, I said, this man who lived among us was a saint. You see, there are two kinds of atheism. There's the atheism of the head, and there's the atheism of the heart. And in Psalm 14, which we read this morning, it's talking about the atheism of the heart. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. Interesting, isn't it? It doesn't say the fool says in his head, there is no God. Oh, there are many people who say in their head, there is a God. They might say the Apostles' Creed. It's in the head. They might know the 23rd Psalm. They might be able to tell us the Christmas story and the Easter story. They may be able to repeat the Apostles' Creed. It's in the head. But is it in the heart? If you say in your head that you believe in God, but don't say you believe in God in your heart, you're a fool, says the Bible. The word fool in the Bible is the word that is the most contemptuous term that is ever said about a human life. Nothing can ever be said that is worse than the word fool. Fool is connected somewhat, we could think of it as a balloon that is inflated with air, full of air, and then it collapses. That collapse is also related to corpse. Fool, collapse, corpse. There is nothing worse that could ever be said of a human being in the Bible than that person being a fool. Which is what we call this parable that we read this morning from the 12th chapter of Luke. It's called the rich fool. Did you notice that as we read through that story, how many times it says, I? What shall I do? He says to himself, I know what I'll do. I will build builder barns. I will store my grain. I will say to my soul, I. In order for us to believe in the heart, we have to get, it's a word maybe you haven't used before like this, we have to get unselfed. Do you know what I mean by that? You can believe in God in your head and still have at the center of your life, my life, the I. And when you do that, when the I is at the center, if you haven't been able to unself, if the I is at the center, then God is in the head and God is the errand boy. God is there for me. God is there to take care of my needs, my safety, my concerns, my happiness. Eat, drink, and be merry. It's all about me. It's all about I. It's all about my comfort. And God's there to help me to achieve the I. We have to be able to unself in order for us to believe. And God is not the errand boy who does what we want. God becomes enthroned as the center. When we are not unselfed and God is the errand boy, other people then become commodities. Things, objects, to be ignored or used or abused or whatever. Did you catch that wonderful, powerful verse of the 14th Psalm where the writer says, "They eat my people as they eat bread." My people eaten. My people ignored. My people abused. My people oppressed. My people gobbled up. As long as we are at the center, God is the errand boy, and other people are there simply for us to ignore and to use and to eat up like bread. I don't know if you know the name of Harriet Beecher Stowe, but you probably have heard of Uncle Tom's Cabin. She's the writer of that book, Harriet Beecher Stowe. She had a brother who was a minister who in his day and in American history is just as famous as she is, and his name was Henry Ward Beecher. They were both Beechers. It has been said that this brother and sister combination did more to abolish slavery before the Civil War than any two people who lived. Harriet Beecher Stowe with Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Henry Ward Beecher, who was pastor of Plymouth Congregational Church in Brooklyn, New York, and his preaching in the early 19th century. I've been in that church. It's a beautiful, large church in Brooklyn. I've been to the cemetery where he was buried in Brooklyn. Henry Ward Beecher preached often on abolition, the cruelty and the crime and the pain and suffering and the wrong and the evil of slavery. And on more than one occasion, he actually had slave auctions in the church. One Sunday morning, in the first Sunday of June in 1856, he had in the congregation a young woman by the name of Sarah. Sarah had an interesting story. She had been born a slave in Washington, D.C. Her father was white. He decided when she got old enough that he would sell her down south. And she was actually sold for $1,200. But because of the circumstances, the way they worked out, she was also given an opportunity to buy her own freedom if she could come up with $1,200. Somebody in Washington donated $100. An abolitionist society pledged $400. But now she still needed $400, $500, $600 for her freedom. And someone wrote Henry Ward Beecher in Brooklyn, New York, and told him about this young woman. And he was able to get her for just that temporary day to come to his church in Brooklyn, New York. And at the end of the service, before the benediction was pronounced, he said, "Come up here, Sarah, and let us see you." She was lovely, she was beautiful, she was young, she was precious, she was shy. And she stood there before this huge congregation of people. And Henry Ward Beecher had the ushers come and start through the congregation to receive money. Women who didn't have any money in their purse would take off their jewelry. Others would get out of their pockets and purses, place money in the offering plate. And Henry Ward Beecher, always the theatrical one. Sometimes preachers get theatrical, but you got to give us a little bit. Got up as the plates were being passed, and he said, "I see that the plates are being filled to overflowing." And somebody stood and said, "Reverend Beecher, someone has just pledged to give the balance if we don't get enough money." And a young woman got her freedom that day. And as Psalm 14 ends, it says, "Jacob will rejoice, and Israel will be glad." And that day, at the Plymouth Congregational Church, Jacob rejoiced, and Israel was glad. You see, the whole point is, God hasn't put us in this world, placed us in this planet, given us this marvelous world, this fantastic environment, this body, this mind. God hasn't given this to us so that we can be a great big I, so that we can find the purpose of our life. What? Eat, drink, and be merry. Oh my goodness, it's so much bigger than that. There's this big world, this big thing that God has given to us to live in. This big calling to get unself, to get out of the I, and to join God's great big work in the world. Israel and Jacob singing and rejoicing. Do you get it? It's a we. It's big. It involves all of us. Loving and caring and sharing, working, blessing one another in God's world. It's big. It's big. Bigger than the little I. I don't have a Sarah this morning to call up. I don't have one. But maybe you have one in your head and in your mind. Do you have an imagination? If you do, use it right now. If you have any kind of an imagination at all, there's a Sarah that we would call up today, isn't there? The Sarah in my mind is a woman who lives in a country we probably couldn't find on the map if we tried. She's pregnant. She has a child holding one hand, and on her head is a huge vase for water. She has to walk 4 miles a day to get water. She has to gather 100 pounds of water for every single human being in her family. She spends most of her life walking with water on her head. Come up here, Sarah, so that we can see you. Can you see Sarah? Sarah is a boy. He's 10 years old. He's about this tall. He was kidnapped from his village. They gave him a gun, put a uniform on him. He's called a child soldier. The gun that he carries is almost as big as he is, and he is sent into battle or he is used as a suicide bomber. Come up here, Sarah, so that we can see you. Can you see us, Sarah? Here? Sarah is a young girl in Miami. She is dirt poor, but there's a man who notices her because she's an attractive young thing, and he begins to give her gifts, and one thing leads to another, and then she's kidnapped, sent to Atlanta, Georgia, right here in the United States of America, and she is trapped as a sexual slave. 40 men a night, 40 men a night will use this young child. Come up here, Sarah. Let us see you. Can you see Sarah? Sarah, in my mind, is a man. When we go to Texas, I see him. He's out in a field. It's a big field. It's all flat. And Sarah, this man, is bent over, way over, as far as you can bend. And if I drive by twice that day between the golf course and my shack, he's still there. He's still bent over. And I wonder, how does he do it? How does he do it? Come up here, Sarah. Let us see you. Can you see Sarah? You see, all of the Sarahs here in this country, in our community, beyond, into the world, they're not problems to be solved. They're not burdens on the economy. They're not people to eat up as you eat bread, chew up, swallow. They're not. And if you think they are, you're a fool. All of the Sarahs of the world are gifts. Because, you see, we can't believe in the heart without a Sarah in our heart. And when we believe like that, Jacob rejoices, and Israel is glad. Amen.